Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. I moved back into the house a few months after my uncle passed away. It was the same house I had spent part of my childhood in, the same one where every floorboard had a sound and every door needed a certain push to close right. When I was younger, the house felt big and loud. When I came back as an adult, it felt quiet in a way that made me speak softer without meaning to. The house sits at the edge of town, far enough from the main road that you don't hear traffic at night. The paint is old, the kind that has faded instead of peeled. My uncle never cared much about looks. He cared about order. Everything had its place, and nothing was thrown away unless it had to be. That was just how he was. After the funeral, no one wanted the house. My family said it held too many memories. I didn't argue. I took the keys and told myself it would only be for a year, just long enough to fix it up and decide what to do next. The first few weeks were easy. I cleaned the kitchen, fixed a broken cabinet, and washed the dust from the windows. The house slowly began to feel lived in again. Still, there were rooms I avoided without thinking about it. The guest room stayed closed. The basement light was always left off. And the attic stayed locked. When I was a kid, the attic was never a place we were allowed to go. Not because it was dangerous, but because my uncle said it was full of junk and not worth the trouble. He kept the key on a hook in his bedroom, and I never once saw him use it. I forgot about the attic as I grew older, the same way you forget about things that never mattered to you in the first place. That changed one afternoon when I noticed water stains on the ceiling above the hallway. They were light but new. I knew the roof had been patched years ago, and I figured the leak had come back. The only way to check was from the attic. I found the key in the same place it had always been, hanging on a small hook behind the door to my uncle's old bedroom. Holding it felt strange. The metal was cold, heavier than I expected. I stood there longer than I needed to, just holding it, before telling myself I was being silly. The attic stairs folded down with a loud creak that echoed through the house. Dust fell in thin lines, floating in the light from below. The smell hit me right away. Old wood, cardboard, something stale that had been trapped for years. The attic itself was smaller than I remembered. Low ceiling, narrow beams, boxes stacked along the walls, all neatly labeled in my uncle's handwriting. Holiday decorations, old clothes, tools that hadn't been touched in decades. That I stepped carefully, watching where I put my feet. That's when I noticed something odd. Behind one stack of boxes, pushed far back near the corner, was another box that didn't match the rest. No label, no writing at all, just plain cardboard, sealed with old tape that had turned yellow. It didn't belong there. And somehow, I knew that before I ever touched it. I told myself it was probably nothing. Just another box he never got around to sorting. But I couldn't stop looking at it. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like the box was waiting. I pulled it forward. It was heavier than it should have been. And in that quiet attic, surrounded by things I thought I knew, I realized I had found something my uncle never meant for anyone to see. I stood there for a long time after pulling the box out from the corner. The attic was quiet except for the soft sound of the house settling beneath me. Every now and then, a car passed far away on the road, the sound faint and stretched thin by distance. The light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling barely reached where I was standing. It made the shadows look deeper, like they had weight. The box sat on the floor between my feet. It was a plain cardboard box, the kind you might use when moving or storing old clothes. But this one was sealed tight. The tape had been wrapped around it more than once, layered thick like someone was afraid it might come open on its own. The corners were bent, and the bottom looked darker, like it had once been damp. I bent down and pressed my hand against the side. The cardboard felt stiff and dry. When I tried to lift it again, I noticed how heavy it was for its size. Not bricks heavy, just wrong. Like it was filled with things that didn't belong together. I remember thinking about putting it back where I found it. That thought came quick and clear, like a warning. I could check the roof another day. I could tell myself the box wasn't important. I could leave it for someone else to deal with. No one would ever know. But I didn't do that. I carried the box down the attic stairs slowly, one step at a time. Dust followed me down, and my arms started to ache before I reached the bottom. I set it on the hallway floor and stood there, catching my breath, staring at it like it might move. The box looked out of place in the clean hallway. Too old, too plain. Everything else in the house had been touched, cleaned, sorted. This box hadn't been touched in a very long time. I carried it into the living room and set it on the coffee table. The table had belonged to my uncle too. Solid wood, scratched but strong. I sat on the couch across from the box and just looked at it. I tried to guess what could be inside. Old papers, maybe letters, maybe something personal my uncle didn't want thrown away. That would have made sense. He was private. There were things about his life we never talked about. He never married, never had kids. He lived alone and liked it that way. Still, something about the box felt different. I reached for the tape and pulled at the end with my fingernail. It didn't give right away. The tape was old, the glue stubborn. When it finally tore, the sound was loud in the quiet room. It made me flinch. I peeled the tape back slowly, layer by layer. Each strip came off with effort, leaving behind dry lines of glue. When the last piece came loose, I rested my hands on the top of the box. I remember feeling nervous, and I didn't understand why I lifted the lid first. All I saw was paper, stacks of it, neatly placed like someone had taken time to arrange everything just right. On top was a manila folder, worn thin at the edges. Written across the front in black ink was a name. I recognized it. Took a moment for it to fully sink in. The name felt familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I hadn't heard it spoken out loud in years, but I knew exactly where I had heard it before. It was the name of a woman who had been killed. I sat back hard on the couch, the folder still in my hands. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. The air felt thick, like it was harder to breathe. I hadn't thought about that case in years. Most people hadn't. It was something that happened when I was young, something the adults talked about in low voices and then stopped mentioning altogether. It was one of those stories that fades with time, even though it never really ends. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of police reports. I knew that right away from the layout, even though I had never seen one up close before. Dates, case numbers, long blocks of typed text. Some pages were marked with pen, notes written in the margins, lines under names and times. My uncle's handwriting. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each one made my stomach feel worse. These weren't random papers. They weren't things you just stumble across. Someone had gathered this information on purpose. I set the folder down and looked back into the box. Beneath it were photographs. I picked one up before I could stop myself. It was black and white, slightly faded. The image showed a stretch of road near the old river trail. I recognized it right away. Everyone in town would have. It was where they found her car. I put the photo down and rubbed my hands on my jeans. My palms were damp. I felt like I was doing something wrong, like I was reading something private that didn't belong to me. But I kept going. There were more photos, different angles, close shots of the ground, a tree line, a broken fence. None of them showed anything graphic, but I knew what they were connected to. I knew what had happened there. Under the photos were newspaper clippings, yellowed, brittle, headlines circled in red pen. Words like murder, missing, and unsolved stood out. Even now, I remembered those headlines. I remembered my parents watching the news more closely back then. I remembered being told not to walk alone after dark. The bottom of the box, wrapped in a cloth, were cassette tapes. 3 of them. Each one had a small label stuck to it. Dates written in the same handwriting I had seen on the papers. My uncle's handwriting. Neat, careful. I sat there for a long time without touching anything else. The box sat open on the table between me and the past, and I felt like I had crossed some kind of line just by opening it. One thing was clear. This box wasn't a memory box. It wasn't something saved by accident. It was evidence, or at least it looked like evidence. The kind of thing that should have been locked away somewhere official, not hidden in an attic for decades. And the question I couldn't stop thinking about was simple. Why did my uncle have it? And why did he hide it where no one would ever look? I closed the box, slowly this time, like I was afraid of what might happen if I didn't. The house was quiet around me just like it had been when I moved in. But it didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt like it was listening. I didn't sleep much that night. I left the box on the living room table and turned off the lights, but I kept the lamp in the hallway on. I told myself it was because the bulb in the living room was too bright. That wasn't the real reason. The truth was, I didn't like the idea of the house being fully dark with that box inside it. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the soft clicks of cooling pipes, the wind brushing against the siding. Every sound felt louder than it should have. My mind kept going back to the name written on that folder. I hadn't said it out loud yet. There is something about names like that. Once you say them, they feel more real, heavier, like you've invited something back that was gone for a reason. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone without really looking at it. I thought about calling someone, a family member, a friend, anyone, but I didn't know what I would say. Hey, I found a box of murder evidence in my attic. Didn't sound real, even in my own head. Eventually, I carried the box back into the living room and sat down across from it again. Daylight made the room feel safer, but the box didn't look any less out of place. If anything, it looked worse, like something exposed that should have stayed hidden. I opened it again. This time, I moved slower, more careful. I took the folder with the victim's name on it and laid it flat on the table. I traced the letters with my finger, not pressing hard, just following the shape. I remembered her now. Not personally. I was too young for that, but I remembered her face from the news. The way they kept showing the same photo over and over. Her smile, her eyes. She looked like someone you might pass in the grocery store without thinking twice. That was part of why the case scared people. She wasn't risky. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was just living her life. I opened the folder again and started from the beginning. The first report listed basic facts. Her name, her age, where she lived, the day she was reported missing, the date her car was found, the place where they later found her body. The words were plain, dry. They didn't carry emotion, but I felt it anyway. I flipped through the pages and noticed something that bothered me right away. There were more reports here than I remembered from the news, more interviews, more notes. Some pages had whole sections crossed out with pen. Others had small sticky notes attached, with short phrases written on them. Doesn't fit. Ask again. Timeline wrong. My uncle had written those. I knew his handwriting well. He used to leave notes around the house when I was a kid. Reminders, lists, instructions. Seeing it here, mixed in with police reports about a murder, made my stomach twist. Why would he be doing this? I reached for the newspaper clippings next. I laid them out in a row on the table. Each one was from a different date, but they told the same story. Missing woman. Search efforts. No clear leads. Town on edge. One article mentioned a suspect who was later cleared. Another talked about a possible witness who changed their story. I remembered those rumors. I remembered people whispering about neighbors and strangers, about someone who acted strange. None of it ever went anywhere. As I read, I noticed something else. Some lines in the articles were underlined. Not the headlines, not the big details. Small things, times, locations, offhand quotes from police spokespeople. The kind of things most people would skim over. My uncle had circled those parts. I leaned back on the couch and stared at the papers spread out in front of me. It felt like I was sitting in someone else's living room, looking at someone else's obsession. Then I picked up the photos again. I went through them one by one this time. I didn't rush. I studied them, the angles, the background, the way certain things lined up from one photo to the next. That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. One photo showed a stretch of road with a mailbox at the edge of the frame. The mailbox was old, dented on one side. I knew that mailbox. I had passed it countless times growing up. It was only a few streets away from my uncle's house. I set the photo down slowly. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Roads cross, towns overlap. That area was close to a lot of houses. Still, the thought stuck with me, sharp and uncomfortable. I went back to the reports and searched for addresses. And there it was. My uncle's street name appeared once. Just once. In a list of homes police had canvassed during the early days of the investigation. No notes beside it. No follow-up. Just a check mark. I felt cold all of a sudden. I had always thought of my uncle as quiet, but harmless. A man who liked routines, who waved at neighbors but never lingered. A man who locked his doors early and woke up before sunrise. I tried to picture him younger, decades ago, standing outside while police asked him questions, telling them what he knew, or what he didn't. I realized then that the box wasn't just about the victim. It was about my uncle. I reached for the cassette tapes but stopped myself. I wasn't ready yet. I could feel that in my bones. Once I listened to those, there would be no going back. Whatever was on them would change how I saw him forever. So instead, I sat there in the quiet house, surrounded by pieces of a story that had never been finished. A story that had somehow been living above my head the entire time. And as much as I wanted to close the box and pretend I had never found it, I knew something for sure. The past wasn't done with this house, and it wasn't done with me either. I hadn't planned on spending the entire day in the living room, surrounded by papers and photos, but hours passed without me noticing. The sun moved across the windows. Shadows stretched and shifted. I didn't turn on the TV or play music. The house felt like it needed quiet. At some point, I realized I was trying to remember how people talked about the murder back when it first happened. Not the details from the news, but the way adults acted. The way conversations stopped when kids walked into the room. The way doors were locked earlier than usual. The way my parents checked the windows before bed. It had been a long time ago, but those feelings came back fast. Back then, the town was smaller. Everyone knew everyone, or at least felt like they did. People waved from porches. They stood too close in grocery store lines. Privacy wasn't something people expected. That was part of why the murder shook everyone so deeply. It didn't feel like something that could happen there. The woman who was killed had lived a normal life. That's what people kept saying. She worked a regular job. She had friends. She had routines. There was nothing about her that made sense as a target. When she went missing, people assumed it was a mistake, that she would be found somewhere safe, that she would walk back into town embarrassed and tired, but alive. When her car was found, that hope faded. I remember the day her body was discovered. I didn't understand everything at the time, but I knew it was serious. School ended early. Parents picked kids up instead of letting them walk home. That night, the adults sat in front of the TV longer than usual. For weeks after that, the murder was all anyone talked about. People shared theories like they were facts. Someone heard a scream. Someone saw a car that didn't belong. Someone thought they recognized a stranger at the gas station. Every new rumor felt dangerous. Every neighbor looked a little less familiar. The police held meetings at the town hall. They asked for tips. They promised progress. For a while, it felt like answers were just around the corner. Then time passed. Leads dried up. Suspects were cleared. The meetings stopped. The news moved on. Slowly, the town went back to normal. Doors unlocked again. Kids walked alone. People stopped lowering their voices. The murder became something people mentioned only when the past came up. A warning story, a reminder. Then even that faded. Looking through the box, I realized something that made me uncomfortable. The case hadn't gone cold because there was nothing to follow. It had gone cold because people stopped pushing. I spread the papers across the table again, this time organizing them by date. Early reports on one side, later ones on the other. The difference between them was clear. The early ones were thick with detail, names, times, locations. The later ones were shorter, less certain, less focused. I noticed gaps. Days where nothing was written down. Interviews that seemed to end without explanation. Notes that hinted at follow-ups that never happened. My uncle had noticed those gaps too. He had circled them, marked them, written small questions beside them in pen. Why stop here? No result. Who decided this? It felt strange to think of him sitting somewhere years ago, asking those questions in silence. I tried to remember what my uncle was like around that time. I would have been young, but some memories stayed with me. He had been quieter than usual, more serious. He listened more than he talked. When the murder came up, he didn't join the conversations. He would leave the room or turn his attention somewhere else. I had never thought much of it until now. I picked up another newspaper clipping. This one focused on a man who had been named as a person of interest early on. His photo was printed next to the article. I remembered his face too. People avoided him at the store. Kids whispered about him at school. He was cleared a few months later. The article said police found no strong evidence linking him to the crime. My uncle had underlined that sentence. Beside it, he had written, or no evidence they wanted to use. That line stayed with me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself there could be a simple explanation for all of this. Maybe my uncle was just curious. Maybe he didn't trust the police. Maybe he wanted justice for someone who didn't get it. But that didn't explain why the box was hidden. It didn't explain the tapes. It didn't explain why he never spoke about any of this to anyone. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street looked the same as it always had. Quiet, empty, safe. A place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. I wondered how many people living there now even knew about the murder. Probably not many. That thought bothered me more than it should have. I went back to the table and picked up a small notebook I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked beneath the papers, thin and worn. The cover was plain. No writing. Inside, the pages were filled with short entries. Dates, times, observations. Nothing dramatic, just notes. Light on next door late. Car parked too long. Heard arguing. The entries stopped abruptly a few weeks after the murder. I flipped back and forth, looking for some clear answer, some moment where everything made sense. I didn't find one. What I found instead was a picture of a man trying to understand something that didn't sit right with him. A man who couldn't let go. I closed the notebook and sat back down. The town had forgotten the murder because forgetting was easier than living with it. Life had gone on because it had to. People got married. Kids grew up. Houses changed hands. But my uncle hadn't forgotten. He had kept the story alive in a box, sealed away above the ceiling. Like something dangerous that needed to be contained. I looked around the living room, at the furniture he had chosen, the walls he had painted, the space he had lived in for so many years. I wondered how often he thought about that woman, about what happened to her, about what he knew, or what he suspected. I wondered if the house had ever felt quiet to him again. By the time the sun began to set, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with my body. I packed the papers back into the box, not neatly this time, but carefully. I closed the lid and pushed it slightly under the table, out of direct sight. I told myself I needed a break. I needed air. I needed distance. But as I stood up and turned off the living room light, I realized something else. The murder wasn't just an old story anymore. It was part of my family now. And whether I wanted it to be or not, I was involved. Because once you remember something everyone else has chosen to forget, you don't get to forget it again. That night, I dreamed about paper. Not the kind with words you can read, but endless sheets stacked on top of each other, stretching out of sight. Every time I reached for one, it slipped away. When I woke up, my hands felt tight, like I had been gripping something for hours. The house was quiet again. Morning light came through the curtains, soft and pale. For a moment, I almost forgot about the box. Then I remembered it was still there, under the table, waiting. I didn't eat breakfast. I poured a cup of coffee and carried it into the living room. I sat down slowly, like the box might react if I moved too fast. I pulled it back into the center of the room and opened it again. This time, I focused on the notes. Not the police reports, not the photos, just the handwritten pages. Loose sheets, sticky notes, notebook pages torn out at the edges. All written by the same hand. My uncle's hand. I had seen it my whole life. Grocery lists taped to the fridge. Instructions left on the counter. Birthday cards signed with short messages and careful letters. His handwriting was neat, steady, and controlled. He didn't rush his words. Seeing it here, mixed in with details about a murder, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I picked up one page and read it slowly. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was thoughtful. Almost careful. He wrote questions more than statements. Why did the timeline change? Who was first on scene? Why was this not followed up? Each question was dated. Each one connected to a report or article in the box. This wasn't a pile of random thoughts. It was a record. A quiet investigation that had gone on for years that I tried to imagine him sitting at the table late at night, reading the same articles over and over, circling the same lines, writing the same names. I wondered if he ever felt afraid, or if he felt something closer to duty. As I sorted through the papers, I found one that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was a copy of a police interview summary. Most of the names were blacked out, but one wasn't. My uncle's. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Then I read it again. He had been interviewed 2 days after the woman went missing. The report was short, just a page. It said he had been cooperative, that he had answered questions, that he had nothing of value to add at the time. Nothing of value. I sat back on the couch and stared at the wall. My mind went blank, then rushed back all at once. I remembered police cars on the street back then. I remembered my uncle standing on the porch, arms crossed, talking to someone I couldn't see. I had been young. I hadn't asked questions. Why would I have? The report didn't say why he was interviewed. It didn't say what questions were asked. It didn't say what he said, only that it didn't lead anywhere. But the notes in the box told a different story. I found a page where he had written, "Asked me about the noise. I told them what I heard. Noise. I searched through the reports again, this time looking for any mention of sound. Arguing. A car. A scream. There were a few vague lines. Nothing clear. Nothing followed up. My uncle had written another note beneath it. They didn't ask again. I felt a strange mix of emotions then. Fear, yes, but also sadness, confusion, a growing sense that whatever my uncle had been carrying, he had carried it alone. I kept digging. More notes mentioned times that didn't line up. A light seen on when it shouldn't have been. A car parked where it didn't belong. Small things, easy to dismiss, easy to forget. Unless you were the one who noticed them. I reached the bottom of the box and found something folded between 2 folders. A piece of paper that had been creased so many times it felt soft. It was a map. A hand-drawn one. Street names. Arrows. Circles. My uncle had marked certain places in ink. One of them was his own house. Another was the road where the car was found. Another was a spot near the river. Distances were written beside them. Times. I stared at the map for a long time. This wasn't curiosity. This was someone trying to make sense of something that didn't sit right. Someone who couldn't let it go because letting it go would mean accepting an answer that didn't feel true. I felt a chill run through me then. Not because I thought my uncle was guilty, but because I realized how close he had been to the story. Closer than anyone ever talked about. I thought about how quiet he had been in later years. How he avoided certain places in town. How he never liked talking about the past. Maybe he was afraid. Or maybe he was protecting something. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. The house creaked softly around me, like it always had. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. I carefully put the notes back into the box, stacking them the way I found them. I left the interview report on top for a moment longer, reading my uncle's name one last time. I realized then that the box wasn't just about a murder that went unsolved. It was about a man who saw something he couldn't explain, a man who tried to tell the truth, and a family who never knew the weight he carried. When I finally closed the box again, my hands were shaking, because the more I read, the clearer it became. My uncle hadn't been collecting evidence out of curiosity. He had been collecting it because he believed the story everyone accepted was wrong. And deep down, I knew the next thing I would have to face was something I had been avoiding since the first night. The tapes, and whatever voice was waiting for me on the other side of them. I waited until night to listen to the tapes. I told myself there was no reason for that choice. But there was. Daytime felt too normal, too safe. If I was going to hear something that had been hidden for decades, it didn't feel right to do it with sunlight coming through the windows and cars passing outside like nothing had ever happened. So I waited. After dinner, I locked the doors without thinking about it. I closed the curtains. I turned off most of the lights and left only the lamp on beside the couch. The box sat on the table where it had been all day, unopened, quiet. I brought out an old cassette player from the hallway closet. I hadn't used it in years. I wasn't even sure it worked. When I plugged it in and pressed the power button, a small red light came on. That felt like a bad sign, even though it meant nothing. I sat down and opened the box again. The tapes were at the bottom, lined up neatly. 3 of them, each one labeled in the same handwriting. Dates. No descriptions. Just time marked and saved. I picked up the first tape and turned it over in my hands. The plastic was scratched. The label was slightly crooked, like it had been applied in a hurry. I wondered how many times my uncle had listened to it. I wondered if he had sat in the same room, hearing the same sounds I was about to hear. I hesitated longer than I want to admit. Then I pushed the tape into the player. The machine clicked in word. For a few seconds, there was nothing but soft static. I held my breath without realizing it. Then a voice came through the speaker. It wasn't clear at first. Just movement, a chair shifting, a cough, the sound of someone adjusting the recorder. My heart started to pound. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, eyes fixed on the player like it might show me something. Then the voice spoke again. It was my uncle's. I recognized it instantly. Older than I remembered from childhood, but still the same. Calm, controlled, careful with each word. Hearing it made my chest ache in a way I wasn't ready for. He wasn't speaking to someone else at first. He was speaking to the recorder. He said the date, the time, where he was sitting. He said he didn't know why he was doing this, only that he felt like he needed a record, something he could come back to, something that wouldn't change. Then there was a pause. I could hear his breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. He talked about the night the woman disappeared. He said he hadn't planned to say anything about it, that he had told the police what he thought mattered, that he had done what he was supposed to do. But the longer time passed, the less sure he felt. He said there were things he couldn't forget. He described the night in plain words. No drama, no emotion, just facts. He said he had been awake late. He said he heard something outside, a sound that didn't belong to the normal quiet of the street. Not a scream. Not exactly. More like raised voices. Short, sharp, cut off too quickly. He said he looked out the window but didn't see much. Just darkness. A car parked farther down the road than usual. Engine off. Lights out. He said he told the police that. I felt my hands curl into fists. He said the police wrote it down but didn't seem interested. They asked him if he was sure. He said yes. They asked if he could identify the voices. He said no. That was the end of it. On the tape, he went quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different. Tired. He said that a few days later, he saw the same car again. In daylight this time, parked near the river trail. He said he recognized it, not because it was special, but because it didn't belong. He said he told the police that too. This time, they didn't write anything down. I felt a tight pressure behind my eyes as I listened. Not tears, something heavier. The weight of realizing how small moments can be ignored, and how much those moments can matter. The tape ended with a click. I sat there in silence, the player still in my hands. The room felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer while I wasn't paying attention. I rewound the tape and listened again. Then again. Each time I heard more. The pauses. The way his voice changed when he talked about the car. The way he stopped himself before saying certain words. When I finally turned the player off, my ears rang. I stared at the box and wondered how many nights my uncle had done this. Sitting alone, talking into a machine because there was no one else he trusted to listen. I reached for the second tape. This one started differently. No introduction. No date. Just sound. Wind. Distant traffic. Footsteps on gravel. My uncle was recording outside. He whispered into the recorder, explaining where he was. Near the river. The same area where the car had been found years earlier. He said he went there sometimes. Not to look for anything. Just to remember. He said he had seen someone there that day. A man standing near the trees, watching the water. He described the man in simple terms. Height, build, clothing. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said he had seen that man before. Not recently. Back then. He didn't say the man's name. He didn't accuse him of anything. He just said he recognized the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders tight, the way he looked around like he was checking who might be watching. On the tape, my uncle went quiet again. Then he said he was afraid to say this out loud, afraid of being wrong, afraid of what it might mean if he was right. The tape ended without warning. I didn't realize I was shaking until I tried to put the tape back in the box and almost dropped it. There was still one left. I stared at it for a long time. This one had a different date. Years later than the others. The handwriting on the label was less steady. The ink darker, like he had pressed harder, that I didn't want to listen to it, that I knew that whatever was on it would be the closest thing to an answer I was going to get. And answers are not always the same as peace. But I pressed play anyway. This tape was quiet, very quiet. When my uncle spoke, his voice was softer than before. Slower. He said he didn't know how much longer he would keep the box. He said hiding it felt wrong, but bringing it forward felt worse. He said he didn't trust that anyone would do the right thing with it. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He said, "If someone ever finds this, I hope they understand why I stayed quiet." He explained that the man he suspected was connected, family, powerful, the kind of person people make excuses for, the kind of person the town would rather not question. He said he didn't have proof, only patterns, only memories, only the feeling that something had been buried on purpose. The tape ended there. No goodbye, no conclusion. That I sat in the dark living room long after the machine stopped. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. That I finally understood why the box had been hidden. That it wasn't just evidence. That it was a burden point, one my uncle had carried alone. And now, without asking, he had passed it on to me. I didn't touch the box for 2 days after listening to the tapes. That I left it where it was, closed and pushed back under the table like I could pretend it wasn't there. I went through the motions of normal life. I went to work. I answered emails. I cooked meals I barely tasted. From the outside, everything probably looked fine. Inside, it felt like something had come loose and wouldn't settle back into place. And why Uncle's voice stayed with me. Not the words exactly, but the way he spoke. Careful, hesitant, like he was walking around something sharp and dangerous, afraid of getting too close. I kept thinking about the line he said near the end of the last tape, about staying quiet, about hoping someone would understand. I didn't understand yet. But I wanted to. On the third night, I brought the box back out. I told myself I would go through everything one last time, slowly, in order, no skipping, no avoiding the parts that made me uncomfortable. If I was going to carry this, I needed to know what it was. I spread the contents across the table again. But this time I arranged them around one question. Who was he afraid of? The tapes hadn't named anyone. The reports didn't either. Everything stopped just short of pointing a finger. But fear leaves marks. Even when names don't. I started with the map again. I traced the circles with my finger. My uncle's house, the river trail, the road where the car was found. Then I noticed another mark I hadn't paid much attention to before. A small square, drawn lightly near the edge of the page. I looked closer. It was a business. A place that had been there when I was younger, but had closed years ago. Everyone in town knew it. Not because it was special, but because of who owned it. The kind of place people mentioned with respect, even if they didn't have a reason to. The owner came from a family that had deep roots in the town. Money, connections, influence. The kind that doesn't show up in official ways, but still shapes decisions. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. I went back to the notes. This time, I read them with that name in mind. Suddenly, certain things stood out. A note about a car that didn't belong near the river. Another about a light on late at a building that should have been closed. A short line that said, "Spoke to him. He denied it. Wouldn't meet my eyes." That line didn't have a name next to it. But I knew who it was about. I sat back and stared at the ceiling. I remembered that man. Everyone did. He was polite, smiled often, donated to local events. People trusted him because they were used to him. No one ever suspected him of anything. That was part of the problem. I realized then what my uncle had been afraid to say out loud. Not that he thought this man was the killer, but that the truth, whatever it was, would never be allowed to surface if it pointed in that direction. I felt a wave of anger then. Not loud anger, quiet anger. The kind that settles deep and heavy. The kind that comes from realizing how easy it is for some stories to be buried while others are pushed into the light. I picked up one of the later police reports again. The ones written months after the murder. The ones that felt thin and tired. I noticed something new. That man's name wasn't there. Not as a suspect. Not as a witness. Not even as a business owner near a key location. He was missing from the story entirely. I thought about the tape where my uncle talked about patterns, about memories, about not having proof. Proof is a strange thing. People like to think it's clear and solid. that it settles things. But proof depends on what people are willing to look at. And sometimes what they are willing to ignore. I realized then that my uncle hadn't stayed quiet because he didn't care. He stayed quiet because he knew how the town worked. He knew what would happen if he accused the wrong person without something undeniable in his hands. He knew he would be dismissed. Or worse, he knew his words would be twisted until they meant nothing at all. So he did the only thing he felt he could do. He recorded. He documented. He waited. And then he ran out of time. That thought hit me harder than anything else so far. This wasn't just a box of evidence. It was a message meant for someone who would come later. Someone who might live in a different time. Someone who might be willing to ask questions again. Someone like me. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel ready. I felt small and tired and unsure. But I also felt something else, just barely. Responsibility. I gathered everything back into the box. But I didn't hide it this time. I set it back on the table and left it there, out in the open. The house creaked softly around me. Like it was settling into a new shape. I walked through each room, turning off lights, locking doors, moving slowly. When I reached the hallway, I paused beneath the attic opening. I looked up at it and thought about how long the box had been hidden up there. How many years had passed while the truth sat in the dark, waiting for someone to notice the water stain, to look up, to ask why. I went back to the living room and sat down. For the first time since finding the box, I stopped asking what my uncle had been afraid of, and started asking what I was going to do next. Because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes, it just waits for the right person to find it. The next morning, I called in sick to work. It wasn't a lie, not really. I didn't feel well. My body was moving, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I knew I wouldn't be able to sit at a desk and pretend to care about anything normal while that box waited for me at home. After I hung up the phone, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the sink. I tried to picture what my uncle's life must have been like while he carried all of this. Going to work, buying groceries, making small talk, all while holding on to a truth he didn't trust anyone else with. I finally sat down at the table and pulled the box toward me again. This time, I didn't feel fear. I felt focused. I decided to treat the contents the way the police should have. Not emotionally, not personally, just carefully, step by step, piece by piece. I started with the timeline. I laid out every report, article, and note in order by date. When I stepped back and looked at it all together, something became clear right away. The public story and the private details didn't line up as neatly as people had been led to believe. There were small gaps, hours that were brushed past, movements that were assumed instead of confirmed. I picked up a report from the night the woman went missing. It stated the time she was last seen, the time her car was found, and the estimated time of death. Clean. Simple. Then I read my uncle's notes beside it. Car seen earlier. Sound reported before last sighting. Time adjusted later. Adjusted. I flipped through the later reports and found where the time had changed. Not by much, less than an hour, but enough to shift where certain people were supposed to be at certain moments. Enough to move suspicion away from someone who would have been uncomfortably close. I felt my jaw tighten. I turned to the photographs again. This time, I didn't just look at what they showed. I looked at what they didn't. One photo showed the road near the river. Another showed the same spot from a different angle. A third showed tire marks near the edge of the gravel. Only one report mentioned those marks, and it dismissed them, likely unrelated. My uncle had written a single word beneath that line. Why? I zoomed in on the photo with my phone, taking a picture of the picture. I could see the pattern clearly. Not random, not messy. A clean pull-off, a controlled stop. Someone who knew the area. Someone who wasn't rushing. I moved on to witness statements. Most were short. Neighbors who heard nothing. Drivers who saw nothing unusual. People who couldn't remember exact times. But one statement stood out. A woman who said she heard voices near the river that night. A man and a woman. Raised voices. She couldn't make out words. She called it in the next morning. The report noted it, and then did nothing with it. My uncle had written beside it. Matches my report. I checked the dates. Her call came in one day after my uncle's interview. Two reports saying the same thing. Neither followed up. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I felt a slow, cold understanding spread through me. This wasn't about missing clues. It was about deciding which ones mattered. I opened the notebook again, flipping through the later pages. The entries became less frequent over time, but more pointed. He's being protected. They won't touch him. Too many ties. I stopped on one entry written years after the murder. I went back today. Nothing has changed. That line hurt more than I expected. That I imagined my uncle standing near the river years later, looking at the same water, the same trees, knowing the truth was still there, untouched. That I thought about the people who worked the case. I didn't think they were all bad. Most probably believed they were doing their jobs. But systems don't need evil to fail people. They just need comfort, routine, the desire to keep things calm. I realized something else then. Even if the police had reopened the case later, the evidence wouldn't have been there anymore. Memories fade. Witnesses move or pass away. Places change. And the most important details, they were never recorded properly in the first place. I gathered the papers into smaller piles. Things that were ignored. Things that were changed. Things that vanished. My uncle hadn't just been saving information. He had been saving the truth as best he could. I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride that he had cared enough to keep going when everyone else stopped. Sadness that he had felt so alone doing it. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. The weight of the box felt heavier now, even though nothing had changed physically. Knowledge does that. It adds weight without adding mass. I finally understood why the case was never solved. Not because it was impossible, but because solving it would have made too many people uncomfortable. And once that happens, silence becomes easier than justice. I packed everything back into the box again. But this time I added something new, the note. Just a few lines, written in my own handwriting. I see it now. You weren't wrong. I won't pretend I didn't find this. I placed the note on top and closed the lid. The house was quiet again, but it felt different than before. Less like it was watching me, and more like it was waiting. Waiting to see if I would do what my uncle couldn't. Or if I would choose the same silence he had been forced to live with. I didn't make the decision all at once, and anyone who says they would is lying, because knowing the truth and acting on it are two very different things. And once you understand that, you also understand why so many people stay quiet, because silence is easy and action is heavy. And for days after I closed the box again, I carried that weight with me everywhere. Feeling it when I drove past the river, when I walked through town and saw faces that had no idea what was buried beneath there. Routines, when I stood in the grocery store and realized how many people here had lived their whole lives without knowing the full story of the woman whose name still sat in my uncle's careful handwriting. And I kept asking myself the same questions over and over, not about guilt or innocence but about responsibility, about whether it was my place to reopen something everyone else had agreed to forget, about whether telling the truth now would bring justice or only pain, because the past doesn't stay neatly in the past once you drag it into the light. It spills into the present and stains everything it touches, and I understood then why my uncle had waited and still never moved, because once you speak, you can't take it back, and yet the longer I held onto the box, the more it felt like the house itself was pressing in on me, like the walls remembered something I was trying not to. And one afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room with the box open again, touching the edges of the folders, tracing the dates with my fingers, and realizing that this wasn't really about solving the murder anymore, because that might never happen, not fully, not cleanly. It was about refusing to let the truth disappear just because it was inconvenient. And that was when I decided the box didn't belong to me, not really, it never had. It belonged to the story, to the woman whose life ended and whose name had been reduced to a cold case number, to my uncle who had done everything he could without destroying himself in the process. And I knew then I couldn't just hand it to the local police and walk away, because too much time had passed and too many connections still ran deep. So instead I made copies of everything, every report, every photo, every note, every tape. I digitized the audio and labeled it carefully, keeping my uncle's dates and adding my own. And the act of doing that felt strange and quiet and serious, like I was stepping into his place, without ever asking to. And when it was done, I reached out to someone outside the town, someone who had no ties here, someone whose job was to look at forgotten cases with fresh eyes. And when I sent the files, I didn't accuse anyone or make claims I couldn't prove. I simply told the truth as clearly as I could, that this evidence had been hidden, that details had been ignored, that someone had tried to preserve what others had let fade. And then I waited. And the waiting was worse than the fear, because it gave my mind time to imagine every outcome, the case reopening, the town pushing back, people asking why I couldn't just let the past stay buried. And sometimes, late at night, I understood those people because digging up the truth doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it just brings noise and anger and grief that had learned to live quietly. But even knowing that, I never once wished I had left the box in the attic. Because once you see the shape of the truth, you can't pretend it isn't there, and whether anything comes of it or not, whether justice is ever done in a way that feels complete, I know this much for certain: the story didn't end in silence this time, and the woman at the center of it is no longer just a name on a forgotten folder, and my uncle is no longer just a quiet man who kept to himself, because their voices are out there now, finally heard, and the house feels lighter because of it. Not peaceful, not happy, but honest, and sometimes honesty is the only kind of peace you get. After I sent everything away, the house changed in ways that were hard to explain and impossible to ignore. Nothing physical was different. The walls didn't move. The floors didn't creak any more or less than they always had. The furniture stayed where it was. But the feeling inside the house shifted, like something that had been pressing down for years had finally lifted just enough to let air in. I hadn't realized how heavy it felt before until that weight wasn't fully there anymore. The box was gone from the living room table, but I still found myself glancing at that spot out of habit. My eyes would drift there while I drank coffee in the morning or sat on the couch at night, and for a split second I would expect to see it waiting for me. Each time I remembered it was no longer there, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. The box had been a burden, but it had also been a connection. To my uncle, to the woman whose life ended too soon, to a truth that refused to stay quiet. I walked through the house more slowly after that. I noticed small things I had overlooked before. Scratches on the doorframe where my uncle used to mark his height. A loose floorboard near the hallway he never fixed, even though he fixed everything else. A chair by the window where he must have sat countless nights, watching the street, listening, remembering. I wondered how many times he had looked out from that spot, replaying the same night in his head, asking himself if there was something more he should have done. Sometimes I caught myself feeling angry at him. Not for what he did, but for what he didn't. For staying quiet. For hiding the box. For leaving me to deal with it after he was gone. But that anger never lasted long. It faded into something softer, something closer to understanding. He had lived in a different time, a different town, a place where certain names carried weight, and certain truths came with consequences that didn't always feel worth the cost. At night, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. Not empty, just calm. I slept better, even though my dreams were still full of half-remembered faces and voices that didn't quite make sense. I dreamed of the river more than once, of water moving slowly, carrying things away without asking permission. I dreamed of paper drifting downstream, words blurring as they soaked through, until only the feeling remained. Days passed, then weeks. I didn't hear anything at first. No calls, no emails, no signs that what I had sent had landed anywhere at all. That waiting brought its own kind of fear, the kind that creeps in quietly and makes you question every choice you've made. I wondered if I had done the right thing. I wondered if I had stirred something up only to watch it settle back into silence again. But even if nothing came of it, I knew something had already changed. That I started noticing small conversations around town. Nothing direct, just hints. A comment at the store about that old case. Someone mentioning the woman's name again. Slowly, like testing how it felt in their mouth after all these years. Could have been a coincidence. Or it could have been the beginning of something moving beneath the surface. I avoided talking about it myself. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to shape the story before it had a chance to stand on its own. The truth didn't need help from me. It just needed space. One evening, as I stood in the hallway beneath the attic door, I realized I hadn't gone up there since the day I found the box. The water stain was still there, faint but unchanged. The ladder was folded up, untouched. For a moment, I considered opening it again, just to stand in the space where it had all begun. I didn't. Some places are meant to stay as they are, not hidden, just finished. I turned off the hallway light and went back to the living room. I sat down in my uncle's chair by the window and looked out at the quiet street. The same street where nothing ever seemed to happen. The same street where something terrible once did. I thought about the woman whose name had pulled me into all of this. about how she had become a memory instead of a person, a story instead of a life. I hoped that somewhere, in whatever way mattered, she knew she hadn't been forgotten after all. The house creaked softly as it settled around me, and for the first time since I moved back in, that sound didn't make me uneasy. It sounded like a long breath being let out. Whatever came next, whatever answers did or didn't follow, one thing was certain. The house had told its story, and this time, someone had listened. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly, almost imperceptibly, returned to a routine that felt almost normal, yet nothing would ever be exactly the same again. The box was gone, and the recordings, the photos, the notes, every piece of evidence my uncle had meticulously collected were now in hands I trusted, or at least I hoped I trusted. But the impact of that discovery didn't leave me once I closed the lid for the last time. Every morning, I walked past the spot on the living room table where the box had sat, expecting some invisible weight to remain, some sense of pressure that reminded me of the responsibility I had assumed. Sometimes, when the sunlight streamed through the curtains in just the right way, I could almost see the shadows of the papers, the outlines of the folders, and I felt my chest tighten for a moment before remembering the truth had already left the house, leaving only memory and reflection behind. At first, I tried to go back to my old life completely, to pretend that nothing had happened, that I hadn't spent nights unraveling the threads of a decades-old murder, sitting under a lamp with my uncle's voice whispering across time through the static of tape recordings, the careful markings in folders, and the notes scribbled in ink, but normalcy refused to take hold. Every small sound in the house, the squeak of a floorboard, the wind tapping against the windows, reminded me that silence is never truly empty. It carries memory and attention, and the house had learned that I had been listening. I started noticing other things that I had ignored for years. A door that didn't latch properly, footprints in the dust near the river trail when I walked there in the morning, the way shadows shifted around objects as if they were aware of the past lingering in the air. One day, I went back to the river where my uncle had noted the parked car years ago, and I walked the trail slowly, imagining his younger self standing there, observing, recording, thinking he was alone with his thoughts. I thought about how heavy it must have been to see patterns where everyone else saw randomness, to know pieces of a story that nobody wanted to acknowledge, and I realized the full weight of what he had carried for all those years, not just the murder, but the silence that followed, the way the town had moved on and left the truth behind in a box under the attic floorboards. People in the town had gone back to living their lives, unaware that their memories had already been altered, that stories had been rewritten in their absence, that small details of a night decades ago had quietly shifted the shape of the town's collective consciousness. I, however, could never return to that unknowing state. I had been pulled into the currents of the past, and even as the days passed, I felt them ripple forward, touching conversations I had, decisions I made, every glance I gave to the street outside my window. I began to see how easily facts could be ignored, memories could be suppressed, and truths could be lost when they interfered with comfort, convenience, or reputation. The tapes had shown me this firsthand. The meticulousness of my uncle's recordings, the quiet desperation of his notes, the careful circumspection of a man who had seen something he could not fully prove, something dangerous in its implications, something that could ruin lives if it were mishandled. And yet, even with everything he had done, the box had been only a partial record. Some evidence had faded, some witnesses had moved, and some threads were already lost. I understood that my role now was to maintain continuity, to ensure that the story, flawed as it was, could not vanish into the ether. There were nights when I would sit in the dark living room, imagining voices long gone, imagining the woman whose life ended too soon, imagining my uncle pacing the house, replaying events and wondering if anyone would ever listen. Those nights felt heavier than the days when sunlight spilled across the floor, because in the dark, the silence spoke louder than the evidence. I started keeping my own notebook, smaller than my uncle's, less detailed, but intentional. Dates, times, observations, not to replace his work, but to continue it, to make sure that when someone else came after me, they would find the breadcrumbs, understand the context, feel the weight of what had been overlooked. I also started reaching out cautiously to distant relatives, historians, retired detectives, anyone who could shed light on patterns, people whose distance from the town made them less susceptible to bias, And even though it was slow and often frustrating, I realized the true reason my uncle had waited so long. Finding truth is not linear. It doesn't follow schedules or official reports or neat conclusions. It grows in fits and starts, in attention paid to things others have dismissed, in a willingness to see shadows where others see light. I walked through the town occasionally, quietly, without drawing attention. I noticed subtle things that had changed since the day of the murder. Buildings remodeled, trees grown taller, a new road cutting across the old paths, but underneath it all, the same patterns lingered if you knew how to look, the same subtle movements, the same familiar faces, the same ways people unconsciously avoided certain streets or corners. One evening, standing on the porch, I noticed a young woman walking down the street carrying groceries. She reminded me faintly of the victim, not her exactly, but the way she moved, the way her head tilted as she listened to the sounds around her. My chest tightened for reasons I didn't entirely understand. I realized then that the ripple of silence that had followed the murder was still moving outward, touching lives in ways no one had noticed, and now I was part of it. And yet, I felt a cautious optimism because the box, my uncle's voice, the meticulous records, they had begun a new chain of awareness. Someone, somewhere, would continue it. And as I locked the doors that night and listened to the wind brushing against the siding, I understood that some truths are heavy, some truths are dangerous, but they are never truly lost if someone is willing to carry them forward. I leaned against the doorframe, breathing slowly, feeling the pulse of the house, and for the first time, I felt a tentative sense of completion. Not because the story was over, but because someone was finally paying attention, someone was finally listening, and the ripples of silence that had been carried for decades were starting to reach new ears, new minds, and maybe, just maybe, a small measure of justice, quiet and patient, would follow.